My parents were married in Henderson County in 1910. I know that they were likely acquainted as school children when they were young, but her family moved to Oklahoma, where she lived until she was grown, and she even worked there. But she came back at Christmas time to visit her sisters, and who had married brothers, and while there they were married at Christmas time, and that would have been 1910, and I guess it was about a couple of years later that my sister was born. She was born in 1912, and when she was 4 years old, I was added to the family, and that was 1916. So we were all born in Henderson County, Texas. My father's parents were John and Mary Jane Abernathy. He married Willie Jane Bracefield, whose parents were Laura and Allison Asbury Bracefield. They were living in Oklahoma at the time my mother came back to Henderson County to be married. Of course, I cannot remember my beginning, as no one else can, but I've been told by all my family what happened. And when I was 8 months old, my mother died rather suddenly. And after the funeral service, my father asked her parents, who were Laura Thompson and Allison Asbury Bracefield, if they would take me, because he could not care for a baby and work. He did keep my sister, who was 4 years old, and he lived with his mother, so she helped take care of her. I didn't see them maybe once a year. For a little while, he came on Sunday afternoon after I was 3, that I remember. And the first time I remember he came, my aunt and uncle, who were still unmarried at the time, played instruments and sang on Sunday afternoon, and I remember all the young people having a good time, and I was allowed to observe. Anyway, I just do not recall ever seeing my sister during those years. She never came when my dad did. The thing I remember most, I think, is my very beginnings of memory. We moved from near where my dad lived and where I'd been born over to Anderson County, and I do remember packing the dishes, helping pack the dishes at 3. I couldn't have been much help, but I recall that clearly. And then they loaded the barrel on the wagon, and we drove the few miles over to where the new house had been built. I do recall being on that drive and stopping off at my Aunt Nora's house, who was also a sister of my mother. But I do not remember leaving the house we lived in. I do remember seeing the new house and the building process. It was in the community of Union, which is just over the county line from Henderson into Anderson County. And the schoolhouse was the center of the community. We had church there as well as school. And that's where I attended school until I finished the 7th grade. Mm-hmm. I also stayed with my aunt a great deal when the weather was bad, because she lived right by the schoolhouse. And also boarded the teachers, which caused many of the kids and their parents to say that I was her favorite because we were together more. I do recall the long walks, the horseback rides halfway. That was for 1.5 miles, and then I walked with other school children, some of my cousins, all the way to the school, which wound up being 3 miles. That seems impossible to children today that you could do that. But we did, every day, did not miss any. I have a lot of very early memories of my grandparents and my growing up with them, as well as my aunts and uncle. But I think that my grandmother had a greater influence on my life than any one of them, because she never criticized. She gave a lot of, I guess, advice, but it didn't sound like advice the way she presented it. She was always kind and always doing things like baking bread on Saturday and cookies. And while I played outside in my playhouse, she would bring me a piece of the fresh bread that she had just churned and made fresh butter to go on. And I have tried, but I can't make bread to taste like that. I know it was special. And she always baked on Saturdays so that we did not do much work on Sunday. They believed that was a day of rest. And if there was church at the schoolhouse, didn't matter the denomination, we still went to church. But there were times that we couldn't go, and when that happened, I remember Granddad reading from the scriptures in the mornings as we sat by the fireplace, especially in the wintertime, and they would sing Sacred Heart hymns together. And I still have her songbook that they used to sing from. And I have other memories of her walking with me in the yard in the mornings when it was springtime, and her one big rose bush was blooming beautiful red roses, and with dew on them. I still picture them as they were. And roses today do not have the odor that those did. They only bloom once a year. And of course, it's better now, but it's not the same. I also recall our walks through the pasture and field going over to her sons, and they had a child, and later another one was born after his death. But Marie and I played together. She was not quite as old as I was, and I enjoyed telling her the things that I did during the week. One of the things I remember so distinctly about playing with Marie, the aunts and uncles would come and bring lunch and help work on the house. And we had a picnic outside. And when we ate with them, she always brought saucers with flowers on them. They were so pretty, and we wanted to use them in our playhouse. So we sat under the shade of a tree and ate our lunch, and then slipped those saucers under the lumber stack where they wouldn't be using it for a while. And we were so sure no one knew that we had put them there. And then when they were through and back to work, we took them out and used them in our playhouse. Another of the things that I remember about my grandfather, I know that he was probably much more strict with his children than he was with me. He never did anything to make me feel bad, except this one time. My uncle and aunt came for lunch, and we'd been planning for a month that they would do that, and I would go with them to meet the train in LaRue. And our teacher for the next year was going to come on the train, and she had been our teacher the year before. And I just was so excited, and that Nora had made me a new dress to wear the first day of school. We stopped back by, and Granddad said, "No, you can't go." No one could understand why. And no one could persuade him to change his mind. So they asked why. And he said, "You didn't ask me. Had you asked, you could have gone. But you have to learn to ask permission." So they left, and I was tearful. Next morning, even though he always got me to school on time, just wouldn't have been late for anything, he decided that we should go pick some of the scattering cotton left from the last picking. It was cold and damp. I didn't want to do it, but you don't say no to Granddad. So I went. Of course, we didn't get very much, and we didn't stay very long. We went back to the house, and he said, "Now you can get dressed and get ready, and I'll take you to school." Granddad did get me to school about 11 o'clock. He went all the way with me. I didn't need to walk. Then the children were all saying $1, a 10 o'clock scholar. That was one of the things that happened in those days, and I was so embarrassed. And really, I didn't enjoy my new dress or the first day of school. But when school was out and I could go home with my teacher to my aunt's, then we caught up on all the things we'd missed all summer and made our plans for what to do in the winter following. I always loved to read, and I read everything that I could get, which we didn't even have much library at school at that time. But my teacher was Ethel Houston from Frankston, and she would cut out clippings from her magazine if we'd started a continued story and mailed them to me all summer. But then when she came, she brought magazines for me to read. And also her sister had a large library, and she brought me books continually. I read even up to some of the required reading that I would have in high school, but I just enjoyed every word that I had an opportunity to read. And I was so grateful to have a teacher she was tall and attractive. She would make me stand by the door and put my shoulders and hips against the wall and put a book on my head and then walk across the room. She wanted me to always stand and sit erect. And I've been real good at that, but now that I'm approaching 98, it isn't quite as easy as it used to be. I remember very little about my dad in the early years because I didn't see him very much. The one thing I do remember is him coming to visit mostly my aunt and uncle when I was 3 or 4 and 5 years old, maybe. Mm-hmm. But it grew less and less. I did not get to start school until I was 7, and that was the year he married again, and he married Mary Lou Jernigan, who was already a friend of the family in that her sister had married my mother's brother, and they were the parents of Marie that I had talked about playing with when I was small. So we knew the family quite well and visited them some. When we would go to Carroll Springs to church, we were often went home with them for lunch, and I was able to see Maria again and her sister Ruthie. I do not remember seeing my dad for several years. Oh, if we went to the Carroll Springs to the what we called the graveyard working then, because we did have to do it ourselves. We now have it a fund to pay for it. But at that time, I would see him on those occasions. And I do remember my Aunt Viney making me a new dress and taking me to the close of school program at Carroll Springs after he was teaching there. And I think I might have been 4 or nearly 5 when she told him that I knew a poem I could say. So he took my hand and lifted me up on the outdoor stage, and I recited my poem, and then I went back to sit with my aunt and watch the rest of the program. Later on, as I finished school at Union, my granddad met up with Dad in town, and he told him that I had finished there, and they were trying to figure out how they might send me to LaRue to school. And he said, well, she'll be welcome to come stay with us if she wants to. And by that time, they had 2 boys, George and Herbert. Neither one was in school at the time. And I so enjoyed being with them and reading the funny papers to them and playing games with them when I would get home from school. Herbert had a habit of running to my bedroom and watching out the window. When he saw I was coming in the door, he ran and jumped up, put his arms around my neck and locked his legs around me, and I couldn't get loose. He would never let me go. But we had a good time together. And it wasn't until the next year then that their next son was born. I so enjoyed being with those boys, and of course, Donald being born in the summer after I had been with them a year. I got to be with him when he was just a baby, and I really enjoyed him. But the other 2, Bob and Dan, were born later on, so I never really had any time with them as children. The one thing that did happen that pleased me so much, I got to know my sister. She was divorced and came back home while I was in high school, and for the first time we were together daily, and I begun to appreciate the things that I had missed. I enjoyed so much of the time I spent with my family in Athens, but after I was no longer there, they moved back to Carroll Springs, and Dad built a little store there because he knew he'd be retiring from teaching in a few short years, and he wanted to have something to do. I had 5 brothers. The last one, Dan, was born after they moved back to the farm. Therefore, I didn't get to see him very often. But on occasion, we would meet either at our house or theirs, because by that time, we had 2 daughters, and Dan was between those 2 daughters. So we enjoyed seeing them get together. We always went at Christmas time, and once or twice they came and spent a whole day with us out on the farm where we live south of LaRue. I think that we missed so much in the years that we didn't see each other, but I'm so grateful that as the years passed, we were able to be closer as a family. When I went to stay with my dad and my stepmother, Mary Lou, I had no idea how life would be because I had never been with them. And I was never more welcome anywhere than she made me feel, like she'd just been waiting for me to get there. And we had a lot of good times together. When I had girlfriends, and my next door neighbor was one of my best, as we would get ready to study together after school, she would, if it was warm weather, she would always bring a quilt out and spread it on the lawn and come and sit with us and talk to us while we studied. And I remember visiting with her in the hospital not too long before she died. And she said, as I had been there for a while and started to leave, she said, my boys are always good to me, but she said, I just need to see my girls often. And I knew she was thinking about Irene was not there at the time, but we had been together there with her, and I think she was outnumbered by men in her family, and she kind of enjoyed girls to share things with. Among my earliest memories was stopping to visit my Aunt Nora and Uncle Barry in their first home near the one that my grandparents built and I grew up in. But shortly after, they moved over near the Union Schoolhouse and always boarded the teachers. Therefore, I enjoyed spending time with them, and also in the summertime, because they would take a day, pack a lunch, and we would go down on Wolf Creek and fish all day and have lunch. And those were special days. They liked doing that, but I think the main object was to entertain me. Anyway, as I did that, I watched them as they grew crops, and they always had a big garden and spent a lot of time canning and drying and preserving the things they grew. And since they lived near the schoolhouse where we had church as well, they always went around and asked people to come home with them for lunch. And she always had a lot of food already. They always invited people home for lunch from church. And Aunt Nora rushed to the house to continue, even though she had a lot cooked already. I know she always baked a cake and made a pie or two, but if we had a few more people than they really had thought would come, she rushed in and made a fruit cobbler and another pan of cornbread right quick. She had so much company, and I think most of it was because they loved the food. There was always so much, and everyone was always welcome, and they were very good at giving you something to take home with you every time. And I've known very few people that did that, but I have a friend whose mother always did that, and it so reminded me of my Aunt Nora. Finding a jar of preserves or a a little bit of something that she's grown so that you could have a gift to take home. Right behind me is the store that my dad built when he was pretty sure he was going to be retiring from teaching school, and he wanted to have something to do that kept him busy. And he also had some cattle on the place here. Not a lot, but enough to keep him busy. And immediately he had customers, because so many of the people that lived out here in this community were ex-students of his, because this was one of the first places he taught school. And he taught there for several years. I remember a few times coming over, but especially coming at Christmas time. And he always, our girls were small, Glenda and Marilyn, and Dad always gave them a bag of candy for Christmas. And of course they enjoyed getting out and playing with the boys a bit, because Dan was their age. And we just enjoyed being where I was born, which was also right behind me here. I'm standing now on the road that goes over to the Carroll Springs Cemetery and church, and that's where the school was where my dad first taught. And on either side of this road is land that belonged to him after his mother was gone. And my great-grandmother's brother was a doctor in Austin, and he bought this land and gave her 600 acres and gave her sister 400. And she was married to a Cale. Well, I asked why one got more than the other, and they said it was value, not acreage. All that I can see of the house that Dad built when he retired is right behind me. An old chimney still stands, and it was just a little bit away from the original house that my grandparents had, and that Dad lived in a while when he came back before he was building the house. I was never in the old house after I moved away when I was 8 months old, but I came many times to the one that he built. Also, the house that I was born in is just to my left here, and a short ways from the one that he built himself. After Dad was gone, my brothers and I sold that land. However, I know a little bit about their early days there. Only one of the brothers was born there, and that was Dan. But George, Herbert, Bob, and Don were born. George and Herbert were born close by. Bob and Don were born in Athens. But when they moved back out there, the boys helped with the farming, gathering the crops and things like that, and didn't go anywhere very much, even though we would have liked them to stay with us some. And we only lived about 15 miles away. And I suppose they learned to work real hard and save what they made. And later, 3 of them, I guess, were in the service, and each had their own profession, a lot of it in the oil business. And actually, I never got to know them well until in our later years, and encouraged the study of our family history. And in that way, we became closer than we had ever been. And we still love to get together and talk about this family and how it got to be what it is and why we are like we are.